All right, welcome to this afternoon's program, Teens and Social Media. This is part of No Shame on You's new Feed Your Mind virtual lunchtime series. Founded in November of 2014, No Shame on You is a nonprofit organization dedicated to eliminating the stigma associated with mental health conditions and raising awareness in the Jewish community and beyond. No Shame on You's goal is for people who need help to seek it, for family members and friends to know how to provide proper support and save lives. No Shame on You achieves this mission through community outreach programs, educational presentations, workshops, daily online tools, resources, blogs, podcasts, and more. Since the pandemic started, we have been able to offer over 330 free virtual programs through our 125,000 social media following. We share a vast array of resources and information, and we will make sure that we share our website in the chat. I want to thank No Shame on You's generous funders, including JUF, Jewish Women's Foundation, Crown Family Philanthropies, and many others for supporting our important work. Now for a quick amount of housekeeping, please keep your sound on mute to avoid any feedback. We will take questions during the presentation, and at the end of the presentation, you can share your questions in the chat. I'll monitor it. If you have something private, you can put it to Wendy, No Shame on You, that's me, and I will ask the question. And now I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker today. Maddy is a first-year student earning her master's at University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice in the clinical social work track. Her undergraduate background is in history at Vassar College, which laid a foundation for her understanding the way that people are powerfully influenced by their environments. Maddy spent several years prior to graduate school working professionally. One of those spots was the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And although the technology sector was an unfamiliar opportunity, she pursued mission-aligned projects and nonprofit collaboration, including first-generation college student internship requirements. Without further ado, Maddy, she's also No Shame on You's intern, and we just are so grateful, Maddy, that you are here with us and that you can share this awesome presentation with the folks that are here for everyone.
Cool. Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that intro. Well, thanks for joining. I think part of why we wanted to talk about some of these topics today is that these are conversations that end up happening a lot. I think, just offhanded, I hear my friends talk about it, family members, people I know who have children. It's just kind of one of those things that's on everyone's mind. But I think a lot of the time we don't really have a lot of detailed information about how social media is actually impacting us, and then how it's affecting teenagers, who are obviously some of the heaviest users. Brief bio about myself. Wendy already covered this, but I'm a social work student at the University of Chicago. I've interned with No Shame on You the last year. It's been a really great experience for me. And I've definitely learned a lot more about, mental health, stigma, and the impacts of that on specifically the Jewish community. So I wanted to kind of pull up some of these headlines. I think you've probably seen a lot of these, but over the last year especially, there's been a lot of interest in starting to understand how different social media platforms are impacting the mental health specifically of teens. Obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a true mental health crisis for young people. The US Surgeon General has released a report on this. And when kids were home by themselves, they were using social media to connect with people, like most of us were. But there's also been a lot of information coming out about the way social media companies are actively recruiting young people, the way they're using their algorithms to draw young people in and get them to use the platforms more, and how the impact of social media use is starting to be studied more. We're understanding a little bit more about how it impacts the teen brain. So just to cover a little bit, much of this is probably not new information, but young people use social media a lot. I put up some of the platforms that I think are most common for younger people, specifically teens, to use, but those are usually YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. I think one of the things about Snapchat that's interesting to me is when I was younger and I was using it, it was more just kind of like a fun checking in with each other kind of thing. But for teens now, it's actually like a very straightforward tool of communication. I've talked to a number of teens who say like this is how they keep in touch with their friends rather than texting, or rather than even like sending each other messages online. Like this is the primary way that they're connecting. So, you know, I think just to give some statistics, in 2021, TikTok had 37.3 million users just from Gen Z. So that's not including anyone else who's using it. Obviously, younger people are probably the primary users for some of these platforms. There was a research study in 2018, and so as you can imagine, these numbers have probably gotten bigger since then, of 13 to 17-year-olds, and it said that 97% of them were using a social media platform, and 45% were online almost constantly throughout their day. So this isn't just something where people are using it on breaks. Kids have their phones in school, they're using this most of their day. But there's also a lot of information about younger kids using social media. 9 to 11-year-olds, 30% of them were on TikTok, 22% were using Snapchat, 11% were using Instagram. So we are seeing this among kids that are younger and younger. But one interesting thing I want to point out is that kids are using Facebook a lot less than they used to. And I think that this is relevant, related to some of the stuff we're going to talk about a little later in terms of sort of what's motivating social media companies to do some of these things that are a little more questionable to reach out to younger audiences, because they're recognizing that the kind of world for who's using these platforms is changing a lot. So I think one of the things that's really helpful when we're talking about social media is to kind of zoom in on the way that social media is actually impacting our brains. Because I think that it takes a lot of the blame out of, people not having self-control, or people are using social media because XYZ. I think a lot of times we're getting these very kind of excuses that have to do with people making active decisions. But a lot of the ways that social media appeals to us has to do with our actual brain chemistry and some of the evolutionary things that our brain is meant to be kind of attracted to. So I think one of the key things to understand is the brain's reward pathway. So this is a part of the brain in the limbic system. And essentially what it is supposed to do is reinforce things that feel good to us. So those things can include eating delicious food, getting excited about something, making money, having attraction to another person. All of these are things where our brain learns what feels good. So it's kind of a reinforcing loop, and it's a way for us to seek out things that are positive or feel good to us, and kind of be more attuned to them so we can seek them out more easily. But when it comes to social media, it kind of, and just technology use, having a mobile phone in your pocket that you can access the internet at any time, it's kind of hijacked some of these systems. So I'm going to just show really quickly like a little diagram. It's a little goofy, but I think it helps. So essentially, we're getting cues all the time in our brains, different stimuli all the time. But the way that some of these social media stimuli are affecting us in this reward pathway is basically, let's say you get a notification on your phone, you feel it buzz, you pick it up, you see that somebody liked your post, and you get a little burst of dopamine. Over time, each time your phone buzzes, you're going to start associating just the buzzing with that little burst of dopamine. And it starts to form habits. And these aren't things that like we're conscious of. It's just sort of how our brain chemistry works. But there's also something that can happen with delayed reinforcement. So, and this is, I think, where social media starts to become like really kind of pervasive and gets into our brain chemistry in a way that's sometimes really hard to be aware of. A lot of times, if you get intermittent reinforcement, so this is like something that's been studied in psych labs all the time. But essentially what that means is you don't have to get a reward every time something happens to associate it with this positive thing. So when they've done this with animals and they've done this with people, you don't have to keep giving someone a marshmallow in order to get them to do a task or to respond to a sound cue. Even if you just reward them a couple of times every once in a while, and typically when you reward them without any kind of obvious pattern, their brain is still going to seek out those stimuli, even if they don't always get rewarded for it. So gambling is like a really good example of this. People get that reward once, and then every time they go back, they don't necessarily win, but the excitement of the times that they do win reinforces these loops profoundly to the point that it kind of defies logic. You know, people are going in, spending money, losing money, but that 1 or 2 times that they've won have been so potent that it gets your brain to go back for more. So hopefully it's kind of clear that social media is doing this on a small scale, but constantly. So we're getting these kind of rewards, these feelings in our brain at a much higher rate than humans ever essentially have. This doesn't just impact, this impacts everybody, but I think the teen brain is a little bit different. And this is kind of what I want to home in on. So teens obviously are going through a lot of changes as adolescents. Their brain is growing a lot. You often hear, teenagers' brains aren't fully developed, so they don't make great decisions. It's just a common thing people talk about. But I think it's important to understand like exactly how that's happening. So we were kind of talking about this reward pathway, like everybody has it, even babies have it. But when adolescents are going through puberty, that reward pathway and the emotion centers in your brain, so like the limbic system, that starts to develop very rapidly when kids start going through puberty. But at the same time, your prefrontal cortex which is where you're having all of these like executive functioning skills. So basically decision making, evaluating and like weighing different options or situations, kind of judging risks, thinking about potential outcomes. That part of the brain is growing a lot for adolescents and actually has fewer neurons during adolescence than it does when people are kids. But by the end of adolescence, this part of your brain does fully develop, but often that might not be until like people are in their early 20s. So because you're having this reward pathway part of your brain getting very powerful during adolescence, and then your executive functioning is just that part of your brain is growing and it's much less strong essentially than this reward pathway, which creates kind of a perfect storm for young people and teenagers to be kind of thrill seeking and doing these things that bring them excitement, but don't necessarily seem like a good reward for the amount of risk they're taking. As you probably know from knowing teenagers, there's a lot of changes in emotion. Young people are drawn to novelty and risk. And there's a lot of like really good evolutionary reasons for this. When people were back in kind of prehistoric days, the ways that they, when they were young, they were taking risks, they were doing things that would maybe be beneficial for their families, for themselves. And there's also a really strong desire to connect with others. And I think that desire to connect with others, so much of it has to do with, fitting in and being part of a social group and having safety. But for teenagers, that is particularly intense. And a lot of the research is showing that above all else, this desire to connect with others is kind of at the root of what draws us into social media. It's a part of our brains that is really getting kind of tapped into when we have these interactions online. So there have been, one thing I will say as a caveat is that despite the fact that this is something that's getting talked about a lot, there's actually not as much research on social media's impacts on the brain than you would kind of imagine that there is. I thought this was something that I thought was really interesting when I was doing research. I think some of it is that there are so many factors that are at play that it's kind of hard for scientists to like suss out individual dynamics that they want to test. But there definitely has been research. So one of the studies that I saw that I thought was kind of interesting is essentially they put people in, a brain scanner, and then they started showing them kind of hypothetical Instagram posts, and Instagram posts that already had a lot of likes, teenagers were drawn to. Not super surprising, makes a lot of sense. If other people are, interested in something or excited about something, you get drawn into that. There's a feeling of kind of a cohesive, social vibe that other people are going to be more accepting of you if you're part of that in group. So it kind of shows that there's this connection to how other people are viewing things and how other people are viewing you. That's very, very powerful for teenagers. They also showed that when younger teenagers were shown images of like risky behavior, like drinking or drug use, there was actually signs of inhibition in the parts of their brains that exhibit self-control. So getting exposed to these images for younger teens actually kind of makes them less likely to kind of stop themselves. Now, we don't want to draw too many conclusions there, but I think the interesting part is that they did this study on older teens. And even though the social group dynamics, being attracted to things that other people are really into, were still there, that inhibition part got better. So you can see that as teenagers are getting older, that ability to kind of like zoom out and say, hey, oh my gosh, this is something that's really bad for me, I'm going to stop doing it. Those skills get stronger when kids get older. but every child is developing at different rates. And that's what's tough about this is like, there aren't any hard and fast rules. There isn't something to say by the time someone's 18, they have mastered this skill. So yeah, so I think the next thing to talk a little bit about when it comes to teens and mental health is kind of bridging that connection between how social media is not just impacting their brains, but how this is affecting their mental health kind of in the big picture. And I think, there's a lot of different studies out there, but the main takeaway that is kind of an underlying theme throughout these studies is that social media use tends to exacerbate issues that are already there. So if somebody is dealing with low self-esteem or an eating disorder, social media tends to make it worse. It doesn't necessarily, always create new problems, but it definitely exacerbates existing insecurities or things that young people are struggling with. So there have been some studies that show a lot of teens have difficulty with focus, and that heavy use of TikTok specifically can limit teens' ability to focus. We don't really know why that is exactly. Some of it might be that some of these forms of social media are, constantly showing these short clips of things that grab people's attention over and over. And so when you have to sit down and focus on something like reading, it's less satisfying because you're not getting that novelty or excitement surges that you're getting from social media, which you're looking at pretty much constantly. There's other things that have to do with lowered self-esteem. And I think, again, this gets into kids who are already kind of struggling with this. Social media can exacerbate it. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, kind of because we talked to some teenagers. That's one of the cool things with No Shame on You is that I've gotten to work with teens, and they gave me some really interesting feedback about what this actually looks like for them. One of the other findings that I think is important to talk about has to do with eating disorders and distorted body image. So obviously this is something that a lot of teens struggle with. There was a study that said that 32% of teen girls said that they felt when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. So again, it gets to this self-comparison, images that have been altered, kind of tapping into these already existing insecurities and fears that teenagers have, and just kind of blowing them up in proportion. And then there's also some studies that are kind of pointing to, for teens that are experiencing suicidality, if they're having suicidal thoughts, that in some cases, using social media can just kind of, again, exacerbate those feelings, exacerbate those thoughts, and increase their risk of attempting suicide. So one of the things that I think we should talk about a little bit is, kind of what larger context this is happening within. Because it's not just that social media is this innocuous thing that's out there and happens to be harmful to teens. Social media companies know how to draw users in. That's how they make their money, is through ads and through increasing the amount of time that individual people are spending looking at their screens. So in September, many of you may be aware of this, but in September, the Wall Street Journal had this huge expose where there were all these leaked documents from Facebook, kind of looking at the internal workings of the company. Just, Facebook owns Instagram. I think a lot of people know that, but I just want to clarify that. So there was a lot of stuff in these leaked documents. This covered a wide range of topics, but I think when it comes to teens, there were a few things that are kind of key here. One was that Facebook and Instagram, they know that their content can be really harmful to teen girls, especially when it comes to body image, which we were just talking about. There was actually a report that somebody within Facebook wrote and presented to executives. And one of the quotes was, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls." So this is not something that's like unclear or being disagreed about. Internally, a lot of these companies, they know that. It's not actually something that's a mystery. We also know that Facebook is aware through some of this research that social comparison is a lot worse for people who are using Instagram. So again, this is something that kind of is going on, but there's also some findings that even when people have negative experiences with social media, they continue to go back to it. And it goes back to that intermittent reinforcement idea that when you do still have a few positive interactions, even when most of your experiences are negative, your brain still has that desire to go back just in case you might have a better experience that's going to make you feel better. The other thing gets back to what we talked about at the beginning, that Facebook usage is diminishing for teenagers and younger kids. A lot of them are still on Instagram, but this is something that is a big concern to Facebook. So they have actually been intentionally trying to reach out to younger children and trying to figure out what kind of services that they can use. There was actually some information about them creating something called like Instagram Kids. That was something that was in the news, and there was so much there was such a lashing out by parents that they kind of curbed it. But there is really intentionality in trying to draw young people into using these social media networks. And there's a lot of stuff going on with algorithms, changing the algorithms to give more control to these companies over what people are seeing rather than the person themselves. And so I don't say this to make everybody feel horrible or to drive conspiracy theories or fears, but I think at the end of the day, it's really important to remember that like this is happening because this is a very intentionally designed way to make people feel. Like companies are making it more addictive because it's beneficial for them to have more viewers. So this isn't the fault of your teenager. It's not your fault that you're on social media a lot. It's very intentional. And I think that it's just something to kind of keep in mind, to keep some context, that we're in a much larger kind of world of kind of dynamics that are driving us to use this. It's not just about individual choices. So I had some conversations with teenagers who were working with No Shame on You through their Teen Ambassador program, and some other teens in some local mental health clubs in high schools around the Chicago area. And I thought this was really interesting because some of the stuff that they told me about their experiences with social media was, similar to research I read, but there was also some specific nuance there that I thought was really helpful. So one of the things that they shared with me was, and many of the teens I talked to said this, was basically that even if when they try to not use social media, what that can mean is truly missing out on like key social events, group chats, people making plans to hang out, because that's how kids are communicating. And so not being on that platform meant missing out on get-togethers or finding out way later about something friends were talking about, or something bad that happened and you were completely unaware of it. So there is definitely this sense of social isolation. And a lot of the teens I talked to said that they actually did, get rid of the apps and basically had these social repercussions that felt really bad. But another flip side to this is that there's actually, I read about this a bit, and I also heard the teens talk about this, that actually seeing photos of things that you're missing out on can feel a lot worse than just hearing about it on Monday when you're back at school. Just hearing your friend be like, oh yeah, there was a party, you didn't know about it, but seeing the photos of it and seeing other people enjoying themselves can be a really powerful kind of negative emotional experience for teens. Another thing that I heard from pretty much every teen I talked to was that they know that a lot of the content on social media is fake, or it's, altered in some way, or people are kind of expanding on the truth. They show a picture of this perfect lifestyle, or they're talking about how amazing, their friends are, what a luxurious vacation they went on. And even though teens know a lot of that stuff is fake, it still feels really bad. And I think that this is something as adults we can relate to as well. Like people talk about this all the time. A lot of things on social media aren't real, or people are just showing like a altered version of their lives, or they're just talking about their kids' accomplishments and not the challenges they're facing. It doesn't make it, totally easy to experience. So I do think that's a piece of information that, teens can teach us something about. And a lot of teens did talk about positive things about social media. And I do think this is something to be aware of, because I think at the end of the day, social media does have some really positive impacts. And especially when you're talking to teens or thinking about your kids, it's important to know that there really are benefits to it for them. And those benefits are real and very impactful. One of them is just, having more communication with their friends. There's so much communication that teens are having on social media. And a lot of it can be really positive. There's some research that shows that, especially for teens who are dealing with like bullying or insecurity, or sometimes dealing with some kind of identity issues, especially kids in the LGBTQ community, a lot of times talking to people online about it, where they have a little bit of distance, a little bit of privacy, maybe they're not showing their photo, they don't necessarily go to school with that person and have to deal with the repercussions the next day. It can give kids, especially teenagers who are still developing those social skills, an opportunity to talk about things that are really helpful to them. So there are definitely benefits there. So I also asked the teens, like, what do you think helps? What are things that have helped you? What are some ideas, things that you would share? So one of the things a lot of kids said was that deleting the apps temporarily can be a really good way for them to kind of detox if they have kind of a negative experience, or they're noticing that they're just on their phones constantly. This was very common. Now, most of them followed that up with saying, yeah, then I downloaded it again a few days later. So not to say that this is like a permanent solution, but I think it did indicate that like a lot of teens have real awareness about this. And I think that was something that I think is a really important takeaway. And you may already know this from talking to your teenagers, but kids are really aware of a lot of this stuff. They're very savvy about it. And I think that having conversations with them is really key. Some of the other solutions that they talked about was just not downloading any new social media apps. You know, there are tons of new ones out there. Somebody was just telling me about one called Be Real, basically like reaches out to you once a day and you have to take a photo of what you're doing. So it's not supposed to be as curated. You know, so there is new stuff coming out all the time. And for some teens, just saying, I have enough apps, I'm not going to download anything new, was one of the ways they dealt with it. And then the other thing is just kind of curating what you're following on social media. So some of them talked about how they had influencers they were following that they realized just kind of made them feel bad about themselves all the time. And just unfollowing those people could be pretty liberating. Also, sometimes the people in your social network that you're friends with can have that influence too. But if unfollowing them feels like it might be kind of passive aggressive or create problems, just muting that person can be a really good solution. You can do that on Facebook. You can do that on Instagram. I think you can do that on several of the platforms. So that's just private. No one can see that you've muted them. But a lot of these solutions, I think, come back to the idea of kids being really like kind of practicing mindfulness. And I'm not just talking about like mindfulness meditation, but really just becoming very aware of how they're feeling. So checking in with themselves periodically, noticing when they're kind of having a kind of a bad day and trying to think like, was I on social media a lot? Did I feel this way before I started scrolling on Instagram? Sometimes the answer is no, you know, but I think kind of initiating that practice with kids to just ask them to check in with themselves more regularly, to notice when they're feeling icky and when they maybe need to just take a break from it. There's also a lot of tools I think that are available. Some of these just have to do with kind of increasing awareness of how much we're using social media. And I also want to say as a caveat, these are things that adults can do too. You know, honestly, some of the biggest social media users that I know are people my age, people my parents' age. So this is definitely not something that just impacts teens. And I also think there's a lot that has to do with, you know, parents creating rules for their kids about social media, but then they themselves are using it whenever they want. And that sends kind of mixed messages. So I think these are just important things to kind of be aware of ourselves. But if you use an iPhone, you know, iPhone has something within its settings called screen time. You can look and see how much time you're spending on social media apps, and you can actually put limits on there. Not necessarily that you're going to put limits on your kid's phone. Obviously, that's an option, but sometimes it just gives people a reminder when they've spent sort of more than the allotted amount of time during their day using that type of app. There's also a lot of research that basically just says that talking to your teens about this is just a really important piece of helping them manage their social media use and kind of mitigating negative mental health effects. Obviously, sitting teens down, having a very, very serious conversation with them, often not successful. A lot of times kids do not want to have conversations like that with their parents all the time. So sometimes it's just having like short, regular conversations, asking them, you know, what's been going on? What have they been, you know, talking to their friends about? Maybe they won't want to share. But I think when you have these conversations more regularly, they become less stressful and like lower stakes. And you're more likely to have a couple of those conversations be productive or beneficial. There's also some research that shows that kids who get their phones taken away basically are they're going to access the internet. They're going to use these social media networks just as much, if not more, than before they had theirs taken away. So a lot of those kind of more intense approaches, while sometimes definitely required, depending on the situation, in terms of like regular social media use, are not always effective tools for helping kids. The research kind of shows that getting kids to be more cognizant of like what's going on for them and developing that awareness is probably one of the most important approaches. So yeah, this gives us this question of what to do next. I think getting a lot of this information, at least for me, especially about what's going on internally with these social media companies, can be extremely disheartening and make it feel like there's nothing we can do. And we're at, under the thumb of some of these platforms. And obviously that's not really going to help you get anywhere. So, I think social media is probably here to stay. And that's like a kind of a realistic approach to this. For some people, total abstinence from social media can be a really good thing. Honestly, I stopped using Instagram about 1.5 years ago. It took me like 3 or 4 years to actually do that. And for me, it was amazing. It decreased my stress levels, made me feel way less anxious. But that's just one thing that I was able to do. And there's other things I haven't been able to do. Some of my friends have been able to. So it's really kind of a personal decision. But I really think getting back to this idea that teens and parents having these real conversations can be kind of one of the keys to figuring out how to manage some of these things. And then I think just having conversation both, with your kids, but also just reflecting on yourself, like what does a healthy social media use look like to you? Does that mean kind of setting an amount of time, or does it have to do with how you feel after you use it? Or does it have to do with what you're actually actively going to social media to look for and kind of keeping it just to those specific topics or uses that you were planning to use it for, rather than just getting sucked in and being on your phone, coming to realize you've been on your phone for 3 hours. So yeah, I think talking to kids also about this self-comparison piece is kind of the last thing that I would want to focus on. Social media is basically designed to make you compare yourself to others. And it's one of the ways that we're drawn into it. So just starting to talk about that active connection. I think at the end of the day, talking to kids about the fact that their brains are, developing and social media is really appealing to teenagers, just being really upfront about that helps kids also feel a sense of mastery and just recognize that like, this isn't a sign that they're bad. This isn't a sign that they have poor self-control or that there's something wrong with them. It really has more to do with just like where they're at in their lives. But every kid is different. Every family is different. And, one of the resources that we can share after this is there's some like social media contracts or phone contracts that some parents will have their kids sign. And it has more to do with kind of just clarifying like expectations and getting your kids to talk about and think about those things, which can be a really impactful tool in kind of making sure that you're building trust with your kids and that they can kind of come and talk to you if there is stuff that's bothering them. So I think that's it for me. I think it's a little ironic, but we also want to share our social media presence with No Shame on You. We do share a lot of content on there. It's all intended to kind of talk about mental health, talk about stigma. But I recognize there's a bit of an irony that we're talking about the negative effects of social media and sharing it ourselves. So, if you want to follow us there, you can try to share positive content. But if you decide you don't want to, that's okay too. And we also have our contact here if you do want to reach out to us about anything that we've talked about today. Yeah. So happy
Maddy,
to take
thank you.
questions. Yeah.
You're keeping it real. Social media is here to stay. And, but I think you gave some great tips and tools on how to help our teens manage it safely. If anyone has a question, you can throw it in the chat or unmute. There is one question that came into me that I'm not sure I know the answer to, or you might not either, but I'm going to ask because you know a lot, Maddy. And if we don't know it, we'll research it for you. The question was, won't Facebook just buy the new emerging social media sites who are luring younger kids? Like, is that something? What do you know? And if not, we'll look into it.
Yeah. I think that's a very realistic concern. There's definitely a lot of like consolidation of some of these platforms. I don't know how much better it is to have them be independent platforms. TikTok is its own company. It's not owned by Facebook, and they're, utilizing a lot of similar practices to Facebook. Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that one. I do think that that's pretty frustrating and something to kind of just be mindful of, I suppose.
Okay, well, while we're waiting to see if another question comes in, I just want to thank you guys for coming. I know it's sunny out, school is almost over, life is almost over, but we have a couple of announcements. The first one is that I have a survey. If you have a moment, we just like to make sure we're hitting the mark and reporting back to our generous funders. So if you have a minute or two, please fill out that survey. Also, Maddy mentioned our Teen Ambassador program. It's a place where teens can learn more about mental health and work on projects that they can bring back to their school or pilot mental health clubs in their schools. And if you have any questions about that, you can email us on that email that she gave out, and I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. We are accepting applications. It's a fall, it will start in the fall, but applications are open now on our website. And thank you everyone for coming. I think that's it, and we'll see you soon.